Welcome, everyone. This is the Canadian Society of Echocardiography and the Journal of the American Society of Echocardiography collaboration known as the JASE CSE podcast. My name is Johri, and it's my pleasure to present today's paper. The paper is entitled Unsupervised Machine Learning for Assessment of Left Ventricular Diastolic Function and Risk Stratification by Dr. Chao et al. The corresponding author is Dr. Patricia Picard. And it's my great pleasure to present our speakers today. Our first two presenters are going to be Dr. François Tournoux and Dr. Wendy Tsang. And then Dr. Picard is joining us, who will present the rest of our panelists today. So I just wanted to begin by presenting our first two speakers. So we have Wendy Tsang. Dr. Tsang, welcome. Dr. Tsang is a clinical investigator at the Toronto General Hospital Research Institute. And I asked her to present today because of her amazing experience with looking at AI in the context of valvular disease. So I thought she'd be a great person to help us lead the discussion today. And then we also have François Tournoux, who's an associate professor at the Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal, or what we affectionately call CHUM Research Center. And I chose him today because of his great work in heart failure, also looking at valves and telemedicine. So he's got a nice tech focus, which I thought would be wonderful for today. And this article appears in volume 35, issue 12 of the journal. It was published first online in July of 2022. So we're going to present the article, then we're going to hear from our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So please feel free to type in your questions into the chat function. Dr. Michael Tsang is also joining us today, and he's going to help me moderate the questions from there. So this is one of my favorite topics. Because I'm very interested in AI and how it can change imaging. But as you may know, that we've been talking about AI in terms of echocardiography, but other fields have been working with the implications of artificial intelligence and machine learning for quite some time, actually. So one of the things that is a common theme for this podcast is art, and we try to introduce art. We're all visual experts, and we're very much into images and understanding images and bringing that side of our brain. And so what I decided to do was play a little bit of an experiment, and I was playing around with this AI tool, and I inputted Dr. Picard into this AI tool to see what would happen. And interestingly, I don't know what features this AI was using or how it knew about Mike's amazing advice that he gives to people or mentorship throughout the years, but somehow it recognized that Dr. Picard has this mystical ability. And then the AI told me that there's also some otherworldly aspect to Dr. Picard and all that he's been able to accomplish and how we're able to look up to him. And it came up with this cosmic Mike profile. It's amazing that it's all from this one picture that I inputted. I had no other pictures. And then finally, it also thought that Dr. Picard was quite stellar. And I couldn't agree more. So Dr. Picard, which one is your favorite?
Well, it's interesting. 2 weeks ago, I was down at the Kennedy Space Center. So I guess I should go with the right-hand side.
Okay.
of the slide. But
The last one on the bottom, you're looking very delighted to be.
yeah, I'm too old to make it to the mission to Mars, which I guess is starting to recruit teenagers for.
Okay.
But
So another interesting part of this discussion is it's kind of a moral moment for the art community, because what they're doing, what the art community is struggling with is AI generating new artwork based on compiling images from previous artwork. And is that real art? Who gets credit for that? Whose inspiration is it really? So it's an interesting moment in a number of fields. And I'm waiting to see how this discussion plays out in echocardiography as well. So Mike, I'd like to hand it over to you to give us your thoughts and introduce our discussants today.
great, thanks, Amr. I'll try to keep my comments brief because I know we've got a lot to cover, but do want to make a few comments. So this will be my last podcast as the editor-in-chief of JASE. And when I started as editor-in-chief, I initiated a monthly podcast going over highlights of each month's issues. And I quickly found out that it was really tough. I just didn't have enough time to devote the amount of time one needs to do to plan and perform the podcast and carry out all my other responsibilities for the journal. So I was really delighted that Amr took on this task, and he's done really a superb job with these podcasts. And I first want to thank Amr for all the work that he's done, and I hope he'll be continuing this into the next year with our new editor-in-chief. So let me tell you a little bit about the December issue of JASE. It came out last week. Hopefully you've either seen it online or already received your hard copy of the journal. There's a lot of interesting papers in it. One worth talking about is we have a transcript of the Feigenbaum lecture that was delivered in Seattle in June. And if you're interested in the history of echocardiography, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. And it really goes through sort of from Dr. Feigenbaum's memories and input, sort of how echo got established in the United States. And I think many of you will recognize many of the people that he speaks about and some of the pictures of the people in that issue. And then there's a bunch of other articles that we won't get into today because they're not related to AI, but some really interesting things on endurance, exercise, and remodeling and risk of atrial fibrillation over time. There's a piece on using point of care echo by obstetricians to diagnose peripartum cardiomyopathy. And there's a great editorial, actually both the exercise paper and the POCUS paper have really nice editorials that I would encourage you to take a look at. And then we have some pediatric papers on coarctation, some both basic models and clinical studies, and a review paper on coronary fistula. So a broad range of topics. But what I did this month was clustered a series of papers that we've been receiving on artificial intelligence. These papers have comment on different aspects of artificial intelligence. So, my motivation was that AI is already, it's certainly going to, but it's certainly already starting to have a role in echocardiography. And we're starting to see some products developed specifically as standalone tools. And I think it's really important for sonographers and physicians involved in echo to really understand or have some knowledge of artificial intelligence, so that you're not just sort of assuming this black box and just assuming it's going to always do the right job. I think we really need to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of some of the different types of artificial intelligence techniques that are done. And so I'm hoping that the 4 articles that I included related to AI will help us. And there's really a broad range of AI techniques. There's cluster analysis and phenogrouping. There's supervised learning. There's unsupervised learning by machines. There's using neural networks to identify features on echocardiograms. And over my 5 years in the journal, we've had a series of papers and editorials on all of these different topics. And I'm sure that that's going to continue into the future. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more. And so one thing I would say is that if any of you in the audience have an interest and certainly an expertise in artificial intelligence, the journal can certainly use you as a reviewer and as a resource. So, please either contact me or contact the JASE office, because I'd love to get you involved as we're starting to see a great expansion in AI papers related to echocardiography.
And Mike, is the plan to have that section in every journal or every issue or every few issues, or sort of a focused section like that? Or is it going to change, you think, next year?
Well, I actually can't speak for Dr. Pellica. So I know that she has several focused issues planned on different topics. And I suspect what we're going to see is that the AI papers will get scattered through all the issues rather than
Right.
clustering the way I did here. So in general, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different approaches to AI, and there's a lot of different uses of AI. I think many people sort of think of it as a way to take a complex task that maybe the human brain can't really process completely and use the computer to help us sort it out. And I think that's certainly one aspect. But there's also some very mundane tasks that we do as echocardiographers that the computer can help us and maybe save us time to do. So there's really a broad spectrum of things. But certainly diastolic function is one of those topics, at least for me, that's relatively complex. And anytime I can get some assistance on how to use the current ASC algorithm, approved algorithm, and some of the other approaches, I certainly relish that because it's certainly something that I use I certainly have to assess diastolic function every day when I'm reading echoes. So I think diastolic function is an ideal issue for us to be looking at applying artificial intelligence. And in this issue of the journal, we have 2 papers on diastolic function and AI, so 2 different approaches, and also an editorial on the topic. So today, we're going to tackle one of those papers, and we're pleased to have as one of our resources and discussants, Dr. Chao from Mayo Clinic, who's the first author of that paper, and then also Dr. Stephen Little, who's the president of the ASC and from Houston Methodist, who has a broad range of expertise, but certainly AI is one of them. So I'm going to, I guess, turn it over to, is it François is going to go first? I believe it's either Wendy or François, but I'll turn it over to whoever wants to take over.
So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present this very interesting paper about AI and diastolic function. So as you all know, the 2016 ASC guidelines for assessment of LV diastolic function are widely used. They can classify patients into groups with differing prognoses. However, this classification system has been criticized for limitations, including a lower prevalence of diastolic dysfunction and a higher proportion of indeterminate grade cases compared to the 2009 ASC guidelines. Next slide. So people have tried already to use machine learning to classify diastolic function, and especially they have tried to use unsupervised machine learning with phenotypic clustering. And this has been shown to be effective in identifying prognostically distinct phenogroups, especially in patients diagnosed with HFpEF. But maybe before going too far within the method of this paper, for those in the audience who are not really familiar with all the AI methods, I just want to show you what's the difference between what we call supervised learning and unsupervised learning. And I'm just going to take a very simple example here. So for supervised learning, what you do, you try to teach the machine using labeled data. So for example, on the left part of the slide, you can see that we have picture of cats and they are labeled like to be cats. So you train the machine, you say, this is a picture of a cat. So at the end, when the machine sees a picture of a cat, it's able to say, this is a cat for sure. With unsupervised learning, the approach is really different. So you don't label the data. You just give different pictures. In this example, you have picture of dogs and cats. You don't tell the machine what is a cat, what is a dog. You just tell the machine, for example, check the ears, check the nose of the animal, and try to find cluster. And so the machine will be able to put in a cluster all the cats at the end and all the dogs in another cluster. So the unsupervised learning method is the one which has been used in this paper. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. The problem with all the previous studies using machine learning to classify a diastolic function is that they have not been yet integrated into clinical practice. And the main reason for that is that the number of variables they used in these studies was quite large, between 60 and 100. Moreover, the models were very complex. So it really created a limitation to integrate these studies into clinical practice. So the authors of this paper had this idea of, maybe we should be able to, able to create simplified model which would greatly promote clinical applicability. Next slide. So their hypothesis is that unsupervised machine learning can identify pronostically distinct phenotype clusters based on guideline-recommended diastolic function parameters without a priori knowledge of dataset, and this classification will be feasible even in some patients excluded from prior guidelines. Slide. So what they do, they look at the database at the Mayo Clinic in 2015. They took all the adult patients who underwent a transthoracic echo. If a patient had multiple TTE, then they were just taking the first one. They excluded from the study patients with a prior mitral valve intervention, congenital heart disease, cardiac transplantation, cardiac assist device, and of course, patients who denied consent for research. Inside this cohort, they look at the comorbidities of the patient, at the clinical characteristics, at the time of the echo studies, and they look if the patient got later admitted for heart failure or if they die by reviewing the medical records. For the transthoracic echoes, they were interpreted according to ASC guidelines by the reading physicians, and diastolic function was classified as normal, grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3, or indeterminate as according to the 2016 ASC guidelines. The variables they use as input for the AI system were the ASC guideline diastolic function variables, which were available in most of the patients. So all the variables which were, when you had more than 20% of missing values, they were excluded from the model. Then they divided the patient into subgroups with normal and reduced EF to test the model performance in each subgroup. And from the original cohort, they took 70% of the cohorts as a training set and 30% as a validation set. So following unsupervised machine learning analysis, each patient was assigned to a distinct cluster. They use the Kaplan-Meier methods to perform the survival analysis to assess the difference between clusters. They do the same survival analysis into the different subgroups, so normal EF, reduced EF, and the group of patients with an indeterminate diastolic LV function. And also, they performed a Cox procedural hazard regression analysis to assess the risk for mortality, looking for with univariate and multivariate analysis. Finally, they look also at the impact of LA volume, because as Dr. Tsang will show it to you later, the LA volume was missing in a lot of the echocardiograms. So they didn't take this variable into consideration. So they create an additional model with just this volume in a subgroup of patients. And finally, they performed an external validation using the Topcat cohort, which is the cohort of patients used with for the study, looking at the impact of the aldosterone antagonist. So now I'm going to give it to Dr. Tsang for the results.
So I'm going to present the results of the study. And I actually like a very structured way to look at the data to figure out how what the paper means and if the choices that were made during the study were actually reasonable. And so when you look at a phenotyping AI study, you want to break it down into first looking at the data creation, and then the predictors that were chosen to put into the models, and then the model choice itself. And then you want to assess how well the model actually does, and then how it was validated. So let's go through each of these with the data in this paper. So let's first see in the data set creation who was actually included. So they screened their entire database of all studies done between January to December of 2015. As you see, they found 35,000 patients. And ultimately, in the end, after their exclusion criteria were applied, they had about 89%. If you look at the demographics of this group, you can see that the average age was about 63 years, and about slightly over half were male in the study population. One of the more interesting things is that almost 92% was white. There was a fair amount of comorbidities in this population. Most significant was hypertension, about 58%, and hyperlipidemia, about 53%. Now, interestingly, we were talking about patients that are usually excluded or challenging to diagnose with diastolic function, and about a third of these patients had a history of atrial fibrillation or flutter, but at the time of the echo, about 12% of those did. Now, when you look at the sort of parameters at the time of the echocardiogram, majority of these patients actually had normal LVEF. About the average LVEF was about 58%. Now, again, we go back to parameters that make it more challenging to diagnose diastolic function, and we can see that about 7% of patients had moderate or severe mitral regurgitation, about 2% had moderate or severe aortic regurgitation, and about 8% had moderate or greater tricuspid regurgitation. Now, if we take a look at the how using the current guidelines would break down the diastolic function, we can see about a fifth of this is a heterogeneous population. We can see that about a fifth of them had normal diastolic function, and about a fifth had grade 1. About 11% had grade 2 or 3, and a significant proportion, almost 44%, were indeterminate. And then, is there actually a population that had a significantly poor outcome? You can see that 21% had a heart failure hospitalization in this population, and mortality was about 18.9% in this group. So there is that. So this is a good population to use. Now, how did they pick their parameters? So they went back to the guidelines, and the diastolic guidelines recommend about 14 diastolic function parameters to be assessed. When they looked in their database, they excluded anyone with more than 20% missing values, and so they had about their final parameters were about 9 of these. These include the mitral E wave peak velocity, the mitral A wave peak velocity, the E to A ratio, the deceleration time, the medial and lateral mitral annular E prime velocity, the medial and lateral E over E prime ratio, as well as the tricuspid regurgitation peak velocity. LA volume index, which a lot of us report, was actually missing for about 55% of their population, and that's why they did that subgroup analysis with and without LA volume indexed. Now, once you have your parameters, so they have these 9 parameters, how do you know how do you make sure that you're including all the ones that you need to without getting correlations? So they use a heat map to do that. And on a heat map, you can see they have the 9 parameters on both the Y and the X axis. And you want to see how these parameters are related to them to each other in terms of correlation. If you want to reduce your parameters by eliminating those that are highly correlated, because these highly correlated parameters will skew your model and add noise and inaccuracies. So if you look at this heat map, you can see that the correlation between the medial and the and lateral E over E prime ratios was the highest at about 0.8, so that there wasn't anything greater than that. And most of the other parameters only had a moderate correlation between each other of between 0.63 to 0.56. So most of these parameters you would include in the modeling. Now, François has already shown you this. They chose to use unsupervised learning. Once again, what you do now is you have your parameters, and now you're going to actually let your parameters use the machine to use these parameters to sort them into natural clustering of the data. There are multiple methods that are used to do this, and the one they've chosen was a cluster analysis using the elbow method. So if you look at this graph from the paper, what you have along the x-axis is the number of clusters that are to be chosen. Along the y-axis, you have something called the within cluster sums of squares. So how this method works is you find the within cluster sum of squares, which is the sum of square difference between the points in each of your clusters and the center of the cluster or centroid of the cluster. And when they do that, you look at the line that is formed, and where there's an elbow is where is the best or the best number of clusters that you would use. And in this case, it was 3 clusters. So they then take their 3 clusters, the parameters that are sorted into 3 clusters, and they break them down by their baseline demographics. And so you can see when you compare across the different groups, they actually have very different ages. The proportion of males is slightly different among the groups. And you have differences in both, like if you pick up parameters, and almost all the parameters were very significant, and also coronary artery disease, chronic kidney disease, history of myocardial infarction, and were very different. Now, when you look at the echocardiographic parameters, again, once you get these clusters have actually separated out very differently. So you can see there's a difference in terms of the LA volume index among the differences in the 3 groups, as well as ejection fraction. Now, does it actually sort them out also by the outcomes of interest? So you can see that among the 3 groups, the heart failure hospitalizations actually differ, and between cluster 0 to cluster 2, you go from a 10% heart failure hospitalization to almost 42% in cluster 2. And similarly, mortality differs with a low of 10% in cluster 0 to high of 33% in cluster 2. Now, what were the parameters that actually make up these, that make up these clusters? How did the machine decide that this goes into cluster 1 versus cluster 2 versus cluster 3? So interpretability of this model is very important. So the authors did this by using something called the SHAP values, and SHAP stands for Shapley Additive Explanations. And how it explains how the prediction for each patient was determined by looking at the features or parameters that were included. And a large absolute Shapley value tells you that that feature contributed a lot to the decision of whether or not that patient goes into which cluster. Okay, now here you can see in this graph here, they've used SHAP values, and they've shown in the blue color, these are the parameters and how big the SHAP value was that contributed to cluster 0. And then the fuchsia color tells you how the parameter and how big it was that contributed to cluster 1. And then the khaki color is obviously for cluster 2. Now, if you just resort that data and you do a forest plot of your SHAP values, then you can actually see for each cluster by parameter which one contributed to each model. And so in a forest plot of SHAP values, the SHAP value is on the horizontal axis. The more positive you are, it indicates that the value is more likely to be classified in the cluster. The more negative you are, the more likely the value is going to be not clustered in that cluster. And each of these dots represents a single patient, and the blue to red color indicates the low to high values of the variable. And you now look at each of these clusters, you can see which features contribute to making that these patients go into, or certain patients go into the cluster. And if you break that down, the cluster 0, the features or parameters corresponded to normal LV diastolic function. For cluster 1, the features corresponded to impaired LV relaxation. And for cluster 2, the features or parameters corresponded to increased LV filling pressures. So we have these features. We know they have different demographic parameters, echocardiographic parameters, and they actually separate into different mortality groups. So what does that mean? Let's look at the actual survival of these. And this is the Kaplan-Meier figures from there. So you take all patients and you divide them into cluster 0, 1, and 2 in blue, red, and yellow. You can see that there is the lowest mortality is in the cluster 0 and the highest mortality in the cluster 2. And with cluster 1 in between those. This holds true whether or not you're looking at patients with a reduced LVEF or a normal LVEF. And that. Now, what about those patients who had indeterminate? There was almost 44% of patients in our population that had indeterminate diastolic function based on according to the ASE guidelines. Well, first, let's see if the ASE guidelines actually classify people and sort them out and provide different mortality classes. And we actually see that if you're normal, this is your mortality in the blue. If you've got grade 1 diastolic dysfunction, you're in the red here, you've got a little bit increased mortality. And if you've got grade 2 or 3, you've got an even greater mortality compared to grade 1 or normal diastolic function. And then the indeterminate group, that 44%, they have a mortality overall in between that of grade 2, grade 1 and grade 2 or 3. Now, what if we use this new algorithm to cluster these patients? How do they actually do? So if they take these patients with indeterminate diastolic function and they cluster them using the algorithm and they get a cluster 0, 1, and 2, you can see once again, it sorts these patients out even better than the indeterminate. And you can see that there is a group that has a lower mortality compared to in cluster 0 and those that have a higher mortality in cluster 2. Now, what about patients who would normally not be included in our algorithm because of atrial fibrillation or flutter? And once again, you can see that the clustering can break down and identify those who have higher mortality versus those who have lower mortality. And same thing, when you look at heart failure hospitalizations, the clustering also can identify those who are more likely to be hospitalized versus those who are not for heart failure. When you look at the hazard ratios, once again, if you are looking at the patients who could be classified by the ASE guidelines, you can see that the cluster 0, 1, and 2 does predict increased hazard of mortality. And similarly for the indeterminate patients, once again, the hazard ratios do change with the clustering. Now, LV volume index was not included in the original model because of the over 20% of the data was missing. So the authors then did two things. First, they did a modeling where they included all the patients and then the LA volume index, whether or not the patient had that or not. And then they did a modeling where they only looked at patients who had LA volume indexed. And this is sort of squeezes in all that data there. But when you add in LA volume index, there is a reclassification about 2.8% of patients. However, when you use the cluster 0, 1, or 2, there is still a similar pattern of survival seen within the clusters. If you look now at the addition of LA volume for those who had it into the modeling and look at all patients, you can see that LA volume index for the group cluster 2 with the highest mortality was the 5th most important parameter. For those in cluster 0 or 1, those with what we would have considered normal diastolic function, or those with in the class 1, you can see that it is least important in those patients. Now, if you look at only with patients with LA volume index, so you have a very limited set, the 45% who had LA volume indexed in their data set. You see once again for cluster 2, the patients that we would call impaired filling, LA volume index was the 2nd most important parameter in contributing to the prediction of being in that cluster. And once again, it didn't really play a big part for those who are clustered as cluster 0 or cluster 1. Now, how does this model do with data that was not involved in the training or testing? So this is where they use the Topcat cohort. And in this graph, you see it's a Kaplan-Meier survival curve. They've taken the Topcat data and they've applied the model, and they've clustered these patients, the Topcat patients, into cluster 0, 1, or 2. And you can see once again, it can actually sort out once again by increasing mortality. Now, there are some limitations to this study. It's retrospective. The majority of the cohort was white, and they were a sicker population. While they did include patients with significant valve disease and atrial fibrillation, other patients that would benefit from this weren't included, such as those with heart transplant, prior mitral valve replacement, and so that limits your generalizability. And specifically, it was an all-cause mortality. So cardiovascular mortality data was unavailable, probably lowering the C index value of the model performance. And then this was really limited to echo data. So we don't know the value of NT-BNP in this, the use of troponin, or other strain, like left atrial strain data in improving the classification of these patients. Overall, this unsupervised machine learning algorithm could identify physiologically and prognostically distinct phenogroups in this large population based on only 9 guideline recommended variables. And the reclassification of those with indeterminate diastolic function also was very helpful, and I think has great value in this. And so this model has a lot of potential to be used. So now I'm going to hand it back to François to sort of lead the discussion.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So maybe my first question will be for Dr. Little. Dr. Little, what message do you think clinicians should take from this publication, and how they should use these results?
Terrific. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking down. This is a great turnout. I see 65 participants in a midday get together. That's tough to do. So congratulations, Amr, and the entire team that's organized this really interesting podcast. I think this is a fascinating paper for a lot of reasons. Anytime I read something about AI, I learn something, no matter what the topic. First thing I've learned when I explore these things is what's the meaning of AI? I mean, machine learning was very well described by you both in this application, but AI can be used to be artificial intelligence. It can be augmented intelligence. It can be augmented information. I mean, it depends sort of what you're looking at. In this particular application, I think it's more of the last, it's sort of augmented information. One of the things that's important, when you first see the title, it sounds like we're all being replaced by machines. But then you realize the data input was data that was interpreted by an echocardiographer. All of the parameters were defined by humans, recorded, and then plugged in as binary data into the application. So it's truly a sort of, as I understand it, a computational multivariate analysis, as opposed to a de novo interpretation of imaging and then a clinical implication. So I think it's important to realize sort of actually what was done, and maybe Johri, you can comment a little bit on the data acquisition. And I think it's very interesting. I think AI applications in echo are huge for all of us. Most labs, I think probably all labs now, but most labs have been in the digital field now for 20 plus years, looking at all of digital data. And it's an enormous issue for all echocardiographers. So much so, a few months ago as president, we started an AI task force, particularly to sort of look at applications of AI in echo, threats, opportunities, sort of all the things that are very rapidly impacting our field. So I'm thrilled that this paper was chosen for this conversation, because I think you can go a lot of different ways here. Some general comments. I think it's fascinating, and one of the things I really liked was the SHAP values, to see that forest plot of this data that we're all fairly familiar with. And I simplify that, it's sort of giving some relative value units to the parameters we all look at. In type 1 diastolic dysfunction, these are the parameters that seem to have more weight. In the evaluation of elevated filling pressures, these parameters have more weight. That's very important information that we haven't had before, and that's certainly something that isn't a component of the current 2016 guideline. The timing is excellent, because we actually have just commissioned an update of that ASE guideline. So that writing group is actually being formulated now. So to have this data come along at this time is very helpful. We'll see how this sort of information does get incorporated, but it's very good timing. So I'm thrilled by the paper. I think there's a lot of interest there. The one question I really have, and maybe Johri, you can comment on this, is the absence of LA volume index in 55%. I know you've been asked this before and you're ready to answer. One of the things that as an echocardiographer, whenever I see an index, I hate to think about index without a height, weight, and BSA. Because if the Mayo population is anything like the Houston population, you know, we've got morbid obesity of greater than 30% of our population. And if somebody gains 100 pounds of fat, that doesn't allow them to have a normal sized left atrium simply by dividing by the extra fat. So I think I never like to look at index without height, weight, and BSA to sort of guide me on whether I should use it. And frankly, if the BMI is over 30, you really have to take the index with a grain of salt. So interested in your comments.
Well, thank you, Dr. Little, for the comments, and I think it's really an honor for me to be on this panel to comment on my own paper. So the question about the LA volume index, I think it's a very interesting one. So first of all, we are actually facing some of the basic data issues when we were initially trying to construct the model. And one of them is that according to our internal protocol, when a patient have an echo in the past 2 years, we may omit the measurement of LA volume index. And I think that's part of the reason why we have such a high percentage of LA volume missing data. And that somewhat causes, because this overall is still a data-driven approach compared to like a predefined data set. We actually decided like, okay, we have this amount of data and which are available, which are not available. And then we follow the stream to go to the downstream and determine what the cluster these patients are. So that's how LA volume index was initially excluded in our model parameter selection. And then the following question would be like, would LA volume index still be important? I think this would be, of course, we need more data to look into this, but according to what we have found is that LA volume index is probably more important in some certain patients, especially the higher risk patients, as we could identify in this approach, as well as that being shown in the SHARP analysis, that we can have a relatively objective weight on each parameter of how they are like eventually contributing to the final model output. So I think that would be what I would comment on the LA volume index. But of course, this also help people to address the potential, like when you're dealing with missing data in your 2016 ASC diastolic function guideline, because LA volume index is one of them. When you miss one missing data, what would you do? Because in that case, many times like a 30% or even higher patients will fall into the indeterminate category. But I think this model or this algorithm will be able to help, okay, maybe when I don't have LA volume index, either it's technical issue, protocol requirements, that can help you to decide like which diastolic function cluster or group you should group your patient.
Great. François, would you like to ask a couple more of your questions?
Yeah, or Wendy?
Sure. Why don't well, there's a lot of people who don't do AI a lot. So I guess the question would be, why would you use AI over traditional statistical methods? What do you gain by doing this and using all these unwieldy things where we can't even peer in unless we do a special test to look at it?
Yeah, well, thank you for that comment. So I think when you compare AI to the conventional statistics, so the study, if we talk about this study, I think the unsupervised approach is actually quite a new approach for study design or rationale. So think about like you're doing your conventional statistical analysis. You usually have like a predefined groups. Say like, okay, we have group A, which has LVF less than 50%, and group B has a LVF more than 50%, something like that. And then you do your analysis. But in this approach, actually we do it like the opposite. So we follow the data, and we the k-means algorithm that we use in this approach to decide, okay, which patient should belong to which cluster. And the output is actually a way of grouping by looking at patient similarities. So what the algorithm did is actually look at, okay, so when you have these 9 different diastolic function parameter input, so which patients look more like each other? So they will be put together as a cluster. And so the model output was actually initially a cluster that is totally depends on the functional parameters. And this is like of note, there's no clinical outcome to be input into the model. So the model was totally according to the functional classification. And then when we have this cluster grouping, we'll go back and do the rest of analysis to see, okay, how does each cluster look like? What are the other features? And then most importantly, what are their clinical outcomes? And so that actually validated our hypothesis that, okay, so these clusters just merely include, according to the diastolic function assessment, can actually determine the clinical outcome.
Johri, I have a question for you as well. When we talk about statistics, it's kind of related to Wendy's question. We often come up with a sample size calculation, and that helps us define how much data we're looking for. With this type of work, how do you decide on your minimal training set, for example? My understanding is if the more data you have, the better, the more accurate. But is there a way to come up with a minimum number that you would input? In this study, it sounded like it was a convenience sample, but how can you comment on that in terms of how much data? Because I've seen some models use very few data, and then there's questions around how applicable that could be to a new cohort.
Right. Thank you for the comment. And I think that's a very important question too. So in the field of AI, of course, the sample rule is like when you have larger data size, it's always better. And I think when we talk about AI, you probably still need to separate them into, say, supervised and unsupervised. Usually in supervised approach, data size is more of a concern. In that case, you usually need larger data size, and sometimes the conventional approach, like power or the minimum data size that you need, is somewhat needed for you to estimate, okay, what is a reasonable data size for you to train your supervised machine learning model. But for unsupervised machine learning, this actually can be somewhat more interesting because what we did is actually try to separate patients according to their own features. So in that way, I would say a power analysis maybe not necessary. And there are also some newer algorithms, like Wendy just mentioned in their so the topological data analysis, so which could be feasible for even smaller data sizes. Yeah.
Thank you. And so, Dr. Little, the question.
Yeah, well, thanks. Quick question. So, this was a great application of a parametric approach as we use in diastolic evaluation. We use a lot of parametric approaches to all kinds of things, particularly evaluative regurgitation. The guidelines have these great algorithms, a bunch of these. And where I think the really interesting element was, the SHAP scores or the SHAP values and that relative weighting of findings. So the question is, how much of the algorithm, I'll say, or the programming that you've got is specific to diastolic function evaluation, or would it take much to tune this target to, say, evaluation of mitral regurgitation severity against some other classic standard? And I ask because the elbow method to me is how I open a door when my hands are full. So I have no idea truly what it is, but clearly it was an elegant application in this case.
Yeah, thank you. So I think basically these unsupervised machine learning approaches, they can take any kind of a data set. So in this case, we're actually using the clinical parameters, but we can also use, say, like ECG data or reformatted image data set can be also used for clustering as well. So back to your question, can we do this on like a MR severity? That's for sure. I think more of an like art in this realm is actually how to choose your variables adequately. So some approaches prior to this work was actually choosing like a huge number of data input variables that could be up to like 50 or 60. But although these variables can still generate like convincing clusters in terms of prognosis, but comes the question, how would you interpret these data set or these like a model output? Say like you have 50 different variables, is the presence of diabetes the most important, or low ejection fraction will be the most important? That would be the thing. And so as we designed the sharp analysis part in this work, so we kind of have like a smaller input set of variables, and then we can really look at how the pathophysiology or diastolic function is, or like which variable is more important according to the sharp analysis.
I had a question about, in the study, when I look at the clinical characteristic of the population, I saw that in cluster 2, a lot of patients had a pacemaker or had mitral annular calcification, compared to the 2 other clusters where the number of patients was much lower. So knowing that, the parameters which have been put into the model can be influenced by LV pacing and mitral annular calcification, how are we sure that we are really looking at diastolic dysfunction?
Okay, yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So as we know, actually these demographic models were not really used as the input into the model. And what we really look at are the measured diastolic function parameters. So I think you could assume that for a patient with a pacemaker, you probably would have like affected some of the EPROM measurement, and for a patient with a MAC, you probably will have a higher EA ratio instead. So, but actually, these patients are the 2016 guideline were not very clear about how would you classify these patients, and I mean that would become like a case-by-case approach in clinical scenarios, and I think that also point out a very good direction of this study is that I think we can probably just specifically test this model on like a special populations such as paced patients or patients with a MAC, and then we see how this model work and how would the patients being classified as well as their prognosis. So that I think that hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
There's a question.
Go ahead, Wendy. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a question from Dr. Sanfilippo that I thought I would just bring up before we close up. Could the authors comment on what insights they have as to how the model performs across various levels of systolic function? I know there was a graph, but do they have any further information that wasn't shown in the paper?
So far we try to use the 50% LVEF as the cutoff to see, okay, for patients with normal systolic function or abnormal systolic function. But of course, if we go back to the 2016 guideline, for patients with systolic function, you somewhat has diastolic dysfunction as well. So we haven't really looked into like a subcategories like a every 10% of LV ejection fraction. But of course, we'll need like a more data set to really look into this, because in that way to divide like your cohort into say like a 4 or 5 small subgroups, you will lose your power in somewhat. Yeah.
Dr. Luong has a comment as well. I think we did address it, but I'll just read it out again. I recognize that many clinicians do not adhere to the guidelines for diastolic grading. If I were to be following Dr. O's suggestions for diastolic grading, many normal by guidelines would become indeterminate. Was the ground truth based on the clinical report only, or was there some aspect of grading for the study?
Okay. Well, thank you for the comment. And I think this is an excellent question. And we need to really clarify what's the difference between supervised machine learning versus unsupervised machine learning. So again, this is an unsupervised machine learning approach, and there's actually no ground truth being used in the study. So what we have done is try to see which patients are more similar to each other, and they came out with different clusters. And then how does these clusters corresponding to the diastolic function was actually our interpretation to see, okay, these are relatively normal, these are slightly LV relaxation impaired, or some of them are having like a higher filling pressure. So again, there's no ground truth being used in this study. Of course, we also analyzed how these patients being graded by our reading echo physicians, but that was kind of more to compare how this newer classification work compared to the 2016 guideline.
That's great. I think I can probably speak for a number of us and our audience members that there's a lot of new areas here with respect to AI and learning. And I think, for one, what I'm going to do is go back and read the paper again, and I'm going to be listening to your comments again from this recording that will be uploaded to YouTube by ASE. And I think this is a very nice complement to the paper. So we are approaching the end of the hour, and I really appreciated everyone's time on this. I think there's one question for Dr. Moss. If Jeru, you don't mind typing into the chat so we can address Dr. Moss's last question. Simultaneously, I'm going to ask Wendy if she can help us finish off by introducing the STEAM portion of this podcast. So we often introduce, blend in some art and appreciation of art into the science of echocardiography. So Wendy and François, I'm going to let you share your screens again.
So you're asked to show some painting that was meaningful to us, but we thought we would actually just take the theme of the session and pull the speakers and the participants and say, these are 4 paintings. Which one is AI versus which one is human drawn?
Steve, do you want to take a stab at it for our audience?
I don't know the answer, but I'm going to guess they're all AI.
Okay. That's probably a safe answer.
All of the above.
Dr. Chao?
I would say all the above.
So
Dr. Al-Mufla is giving a nice different answer. He's saying CD are human, and he thinks A and B are machine.
or anyone else?
And we're getting Miriam is saying A is human. And then Alexi is saying A is AI, B, C, D are human. So I think it's all very random.
So if we go to the answers, A, B, and D are all AI driven. And,
wow.
and how these paintings were made was basically someone described what they wanted to see. For example, B, someone said avocado on a table, and this is what the machine came up with. And C is obviously a somewhat famous painting by Monet.
That's quite profound. And I think it's related to the discussion we were having before, where who gets credit for this, right? So it's some of that general question. And then it also, in our field, it relates to if an AI is producing a decision, who is responsible for that decision? You know, these are some things I think we're going to be talking about from a medical protective viewpoint as well. So thank you very much for all of your efforts today. I really appreciated Wendy and François taking the time to provide a detailed analysis of the paper. And Dr. Chao, congratulations on your work. And Dr. Little, thank you so much for bringing this aspect to the fore. And I was really excited by your approach to developing a working group in this area. And I'm sure some of the points that we brought up today are going to be what we wrestle with moving forward. So I just wanted to end by mentioning that this is volume 35, issue 12, and it's available also first published online on July 2022 and available in the December issue of that. So thanks everyone. I appreciate you joining us on the CSE JASE podcast collaboration, and I look forward to having another podcast in the new year under the leadership of Dr. Pellican. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Happy holidays.